February 19th, 1994 was shaping up to be another normal night at Riverside Hospital in Riverside, California. A steady trickle of patients had walked through the doors into the emergency room, and the staff on duty were busy treating them. At 8:15 p.m., paramedics burst through the doors of the emergency room with a patient that was slowly fading. The staff readied themselves to stabilize and hopefully save the patient. But the events that would unfold over the coming hours would leave even the most senior doctors stunned. One shouted that the patient was 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez, whilst the other detailed the medical interventions they had given her on the ride there. The paramedics rushed the bed through the emergency room, navigating corridors and wards along the way. And as they rounded the corner, they approached Trauma Room 1. The doors flew open, and the bed containing Gloria followed shortly after. Trauma Room 1 was now a buzz of activity with doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals rushing to save the ailing patient. Medical records showed that 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez had stage 4 terminal cervical cancer and that she had been receiving palliative care for a few months. An ambulance had been called for her after her family noticed that she had been struggling to breathe. The paramedics noted that her condition had worsened significantly since she had arrived, and her breathing was becoming shallower and shallower by the minute. Her heart rate was also rapidly accelerating, and her blood pressure had plummeted. The outcome was not looking good for Gloria, but those on duty had sworn to do the best they could for every patient. The staff tried to communicate with Gloria, but all they received back was a string of incoherent words. She was fading in and out of consciousness and was becoming unresponsive. To help Gloria's condition, a nurse gently grabbed her arm and administered Valium, Versed, and Ativan to sedate her. These medications quickly kicked in, and Gloria slumped down into bed. Now, Gloria was unconscious, and the staff could focus their attention on her shallow breaths and accelerating heartbeat. Maureen Welch, a respiratory therapist, had received a page requesting her assistance in Trauma Room 1. Welch had grabbed her pager and her equipment and rushed through the ER department to the room. When she entered, she was briefed on the situation and immediately grabbed an ambibag and attached it to Gloria's face. The ambibag forced air into Gloria's lungs, but it did not seem to work. Gloria was clinging to life, and the minutes were now ticking down. The staff in Trauma Room 1 assessed the situation, noting that Gloria's body was responding poorly to treatment. There was just one solution left, and that was to defibrillate Gloria's heart to stop it and get it back to beating at a normal rate. As medical staff carefully removed Gloria's shirt, they noticed something bizarre. An oily sheen covered the entirety of Gloria's body, and it emitted a sweet, garlicky smell. Staff were perplexed, but had one job in mind. The defib was attached to Gloria's chest, and the staff braced themselves. Whilst the chaos of the defibrillator was going on, Susan Kane, a nurse at the Riverside Hospital, grabs a needle and vial and prepared to obtain a blood sample from Gloria. Susan grabbed Gloria's arm, looking for the best spot, when she, too, noticed the bizarre oily sheen that had covered her body. As she injected the needle and collected the sample that she needed, the highly experienced nurse noticed something strange. As she lifted the vial, she got a whiff of something strong and pungent. She would later describe the smell as being like ammonia, something that blood should not smell of. Baffled by this bizarre sample, Susan handed the vial to Julie Gorczynski, a medical student who was on duty that evening. Julie had seen a lot during her residency at Riverside Hospital, but February 19th would prove to be very different. As Julie inspected the vial, she caught a whiff of the ammonia and also noticed manila particles floating in Gloria's blood. Other staff members huddled around to get a look at the sample, including Maureen Welch. Everybody who had looked at the sample agreed that something wasn't quite right. But just as they were discussing what to do next, Susan Kane drops to the floor. Panicked shouts emanating throughout Trauma Room 1. Gloria's condition was worsening, and the nurse, Susan Kane, had collapsed onto the floor. In the face of another emergency, the staff at Riverside Hospital stepped up to the challenge and grabbed Susan, putting her onto a bed. After collapsing to the floor, Susan came to and said that it felt as though her face was burning. She was wheeled away to receive treatment, but the chaos would not subside. No sooner than Susan collapsed to the floor, medical student Julie Gorczynski took ill. She began to feel sick and uneasy and collapsed to the floor before she could make it to a chair and sit down. Whilst Susan had regained consciousness pretty quickly, Julie was not so lucky. Her condition was far worse, and during the course of her ordeal, she had stopped breathing several times. Julie was also wheeled away into a separate bay for treatment. 2 people who had come into contact with Gloria's blood had taken ill, and soon it was about to be 3. Maureen Welch, the respiratory therapist, fell to the floor shortly after Susan and Julie had fell ill. According to reports, when Maureen woke up, she screamed and cried out that she couldn't feel or control her body. She was effectively paralyzed, helpless to the carnage that was unfolding all around her. The emergency room of Riverside Hospital was now in complete chaos. 3 members of staff had been taken gravely ill, and Gloria Ramirez was fading with each passing second. More medical staff were brought in to assist in the ER, and the doctor in charge that evening, Dr. Humberto Ochoa, was tasked with restoring order and ensuring that the patients were safe. A wave of sickness had passed through the ER after Gloria's blood had been taken. Many more staff would complain of bizarre symptoms and feeling unwell after Gloria had been brought in. Dr. Humberto now stood at a crossroads. The hospital's administration had declared an emergency and needed to decide on an action plan, and fast. He had 2 options. The first was to evacuate everybody from the ER into the car park whilst Trauma Room 1 was sealed off, and the second option was to quarantine Trauma Room 1 and allow the ER to operate as normal. Dr. Ochoa had the balance of life and death in his hands. They had no idea what they were dealing with, and hundreds of people were now at risk. He takes a deep breath, looked down the hallway of the Riverside ER, and decided to evacuate everybody. Within minutes of the announcement, a sea of patients in beds and wheelchairs had filled the hospital's car park. Medical staff worked under the dim glow of the light street lamps to treat the most vulnerable patients, whilst other patients were triaged at the side of cars and vans. The actions of the Riverside Hospital staff that evening cannot go unrecognized, and without their quick thinking and ability to adapt to any situation, many lives might have been compromised. With patients in the car park, the doctor and a few other brave doctors and nurses who had volunteered to stay behind donned their hazmat suits and entered Trauma Room 1. As they entered, they each said a prayer, not knowing if it would be the last time they would ever walk out alive. A large plastic seal had been placed over the door to Trauma Room 1, isolating whatever was inside from the rest of the world. And at 8:45 p.m., the doctor and his team continued working very intently on the fading Gloria Ramirez. With each minute that passed, her blood pressure continued to drop, signaling the end. By 8:50, Gloria Ramirez was gone. The doctors stood in silence for a moment to remember her, but the case was far from over. They took another look at the bizarre, oily sheen on her body and took a final whiff of the foul odor that emanated from within. By this point, word had spread around the hospital about Gloria Ramirez and the isolation of Trauma Room 1. People began to call her the Toxic Lady, owing to the damage she had done to 23 of the 37 members of staff on duty that night. Symptoms ranged from nausea to difficulty breathing and a burning sensation on the skin. As the staff and patients waited outside in the cool California air, Gloria's body was inside and had been placed into an airtight bag to prevent any possible toxins or pathogens from spreading. Hours later, the Riverside County Hazardous Materials team arrived at Riverside Hospital, ready to conduct a thorough investigation. The team headed into Trauma Room 1 and prepared to look for a toxin that had caused this entire incident. As they swabbed and tested away, they discovered, well, nothing. There were no toxins to speak of. The room was entirely clear. Whatever had caused the staff to pass out was not a toxin, at least not one that the team were able to identify. The hazmat team left the hospital in the early morning hours of February 20th, and the hospital's admin was at a complete loss for what to do or how to move on further. Gloria's family was not allowed to see her body for fear that they too would be taken ill. The Ramirez family and the Riverside Hospital now looked to the coroner's office to provide them with some much-needed answers. Her body was transported to the local coroner's office, and everybody waited with bated breath. The Riverside coroner's office had to approach Gloria's autopsy with extreme caution. They had no idea what they were dealing with. They too donned hazmat suits and ensured that every inch of the room was clean to completion. Days passed and the Riverside coroner's office still had not released Gloria's autopsy report. Whilst Gloria's autopsy hadn't been released, there was another report that would bring further controversy and attention to her case. The hospital had completed its investigation in the days after her passing, concluding that the symptoms experienced by the staff on duty that day was simply mass hysteria. The administration concluded that everybody had become so whipped up into a frenzy that the idea of toxic blood had taken over their minds. Those on duty that day heavily refuted this finding, even displaying their medical records and treatment plans as proof. Whilst the staff thought the idea of mass hysteria, the Riverside coroner's office was finally ready to release its report. Gloria's family were the first to hear the findings, followed by the general public. By this time, Gloria's case had amassed large media attention, with the press officially dubbing her the Toxic Lady. Theories and rumors swirled around Riverside, with people speculating that Gloria had toxic blood that somehow infected those who had come into contact with it. The Riverside coroner announced that Gloria had passed away due to heart failure, which had been triggered by liver failure as a result of her stage 4 cervical cancer diagnosis. But this outcome didn't explain the bizarre toxic blood, nor the very real symptoms that those in the ER had experienced that night. Officials at the Riverside Hospital were more than happy to accept this finding, but not everybody was so sure. Behind the scenes, the coroner's office had begun consulting with the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory to gain further insight into the case. Brian Anderson, the director of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, became personally involved in Gloria's case, according to Discover magazine. Anderson ensured that he would be present when all of the tests were performed, and he even undertook some of these himself. Samples of Gloria's blood and other body parts were carefully transported to the laboratory, and the scientists there prepared themselves for a long and difficult period of analysis. Anderson and his team opted to analyze the sample via gas chromatography paired with a mass spectrometer. These two instruments are commonly paired together and can provide an in-depth look at the sample. First, the sample must be prepared and made into a solution to be injected into the gas chromatography column. The sample will then run through the GC, depending on a set method, temperature, etc., and break apart based on chemical composition. Each chemical has a specific runoff time, allowing scientists to easily identify chemicals and chemical groups. Once the sample has passed through the GC, it is then fed into the mass spectrometer, where it breaks apart, allowing for in-depth analysis. From here, chromatographs and reports are created for scientists to analyze, and they will be able to determine the presence of certain compounds and chemicals. This was the case for Gloria's samples, And the report showed that lidocaine, Tylenol, codeine, and Tigan were present in her blood. These medicines were to be expected given that she was on the end-of-life care. But there was a compound that struck Anderson and his team as odd. Dimethyl sulfone was an interesting chemical to have been found in Gloria's blood, but it still didn't explain what had happened in the emergency room that day. Those at the Lawrence Livermore Labs felt that they were so close to solving the case, but a key element was missing. At the time, Anderson hypothesized that Gloria had used a compound known as DMSO to help with the pain of her cancer. DMSO is an industrial solvent that has no noted therapeutic use and is often used for heavy-duty cleaning. That hasn't stopped swaths of people from turning to DMSO for pain relief when medicine has failed them. It is most often seen in the holistic health scene as an alternative to pharmaceuticals. As previously mentioned, there is no recorded therapeutic use and it is not recommended by doctors. Those investigating Gloria's case now had more to work with. The DMSO theory explained why her body was covered in a thick, oily sheen, but they were still at a loss as to why her blood had been so toxic. The investigation continued behind the scenes, and in April of 1994, Gloria's body was returned to her family, who had requested an independent autopsy. To their horror, they discovered that some of her organs were missing and that others had been contaminated with fecal matter. Gloria's family had already been through so much in such a short span of time, and now they were left without any real answers. It wouldn't be until 1997 when PM Grant et al. Published their paper, a possible chemical explanation for the events associated with the passing of Gloria Ramirez at Riverside General Hospital. That things started to make sense. Grant et al. Worked on the assumption that Gloria had used DMSO to soothe her pain and worked their experiment from there. They hypothesized that when Gloria was administered oxygen in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, the DMSO turned into a compound called DMS. The dimethyl sulfate caused the awful smell and toxic blood. Now, according to Grant et al., DMS is an extremely toxic, mutagenic, and carcinogenic compound that is bad news bears for anyone who comes into contact with it. Symptoms of exposure are dizziness, headache, burning eyes, blistering of the skin, convulsions, cerebral edema, delirium, injury to internal organs, heart damage, kidney damage, liver damage, and severe inflammation and necrosis of the respiratory tract. Grant et al. Noted in their paper, although this compound was not detected in any analysis pertinent to this event, there are plausible scientific explanations to account for that fact. The sulfate anion, a hydrolysis product of this sulfate, was measured at an appreciably elevated concentration in Ramirez's blood. The descriptions of the symptoms of the hospital staff victims appear quite consistent with dimethyl sulfate exposures. Whilst Grant and the researchers at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories could not say with 100% certainty that DMSO and DMSO caused the events of February 19, 1994, they stand by their findings. Gloria's family has refuted the claims that she used DMSO to alleviate her pain, leaving a huge gap in the case. Gloria's family would also strike out at Riverside Hospital, stating that the conditions were deplorable, and this would lead to a very bizarre conspiracy theory about Gloria's passing. After Gloria Ramirez made news as the Toxic Lady, rumors and theories began to spread all around Riverside. The most prominent theory is that Gloria was given a tainted IV bag, which caused her rapid deterioration. Some believe that Riverside Hospital was using IV bags to store and transport illicit substances as part of a smuggling operation. The theory then goes that Gloria's organs being contaminated or removed was purposefully orchestrated by Riverside Hospital in order to hide their failings. There has never been enough evidence to back up this wild theory, and to this day, Gloria's case remains a bizarre mystery. But more importantly, I want to know what you guys think. Did Gloria Ramirez really die of hospital neglect and possibly something worse going on? Or did she simply have toxic blood due to DMSO? So be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And as always, if you enjoyed today's content and you want to see more, be sure to go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll catch you guys out in the next episode.